in Atlanta, Georgia. He manages 7 shopping centers and industrial buildings and handles the leasing for 8 more. His website is davidrealtypartners.com. Welcome, Alan. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Why don't you give us a brief background about you and your firm before we jump into questions?
Anton, thanks so much for having me. I've been a commercial real estate broker and property manager for a long time here, working for REITs, working as an industrial manager. I've seen a lot of different types of properties over the years, many different market cycles. I've managed industrial, retail, office, and been around the block a few times. So,
very good. So it's only a pleasure to have you on. So today we talk about commercial leases. And so Alan, why don't you tell us why leasing is so important?
Well, in my view, leasing is where a lot of the value of a property is created. Even if you're an experienced landlord or broker, I think you'll pick up valuable nuances and tips from this interview. Things that will help you increase the stability and the value of your properties. It's the cornerstone, no pun intended, on which a commercial property is valued by appraisers, investors, and landlords. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the quality of the story behind the numbers, which are detailed in the leases. If you've ever had a lawsuit with a tenant, often it could be traced to a weak lease. It all starts with the right form. This is not to say that there's only one form you should use. Rather, we want the most appropriate form for the property and the tenants. Coverage and clarity are the most important concepts here. $10 words can hide precision and cloud understanding. You want to make certain that all of the key areas are covered and are clearly outlined so that even a non-real estate professional can easily understand them. I like to include a summary page with all of the key terms, contact information, timeframes, due dates, lease rate, and responsibilities clearly spelled out in 8th grade English with minimal jargon. Really think things through and include special clauses for unique situations. If you purchase a building and the leases are on, say, a 4-page generic form, watch out. Remember, while length of a lease is not always a determinant of a good one, brevity almost never is. I think that a widely held belief is that the lease is the lease and is somehow sacred, but you should never be afraid to modify existing leases to conform with current laws, clarify points, limit uses, adapt to new conditions, or simply to better your legal position. Anytime a lease is up for renewal, convert it to a modern, stronger format. Even if it isn't up for renewal, you can often convince a tenant to update the lease form if you offer something in return, say a partial month of free rent or some minor space improvements. It's almost always worth it. Modern, state-specific, attorney-written forms will have the most up-to-date rules and regs, so you're legally covered. But don't get lazy. If that fancy lease form is so old it was drafted on a typewriter, then maybe you take the time to review it. Finally, there are many tenants now that use English as their second language, so you should strive to break down dense legal speak into layman's terms.
Very good points. Now, I think particularly for landlords that are relatively new, as well as for newer tenants, it can get quite confusing there, right? There are a lot of multiple commercial leases. So what are the most common types?
Well, there's 3 major types. The first we'll talk about is a gross or full service lease. This is the most common lease for mom and pop tenants. Why? Because it's the easiest for tenants and landlords to understand. If you have a single tenant warehouse building, this format may work just fine. This lease is where everything is included. The tenant pays a set amount. That includes the rent, operating expenses, property taxes, and all utilities. It's the simplest, but it's often the worst for the landlord. The landlord has no control over tenant's expenses, utility usage, or tax increases. If the tenant uses the AC and heat far too much, the landlord must absorb the expense. If taxes escalate, the landlord pays all of the tax increase. This can be particularly difficult for a landlord in a hot economy like the one we're in now, where property values keep rising and property taxes keep increasing. The landlord actually may end up netting less income each year because he's on the hook for all of the extra taxes. Also, if a tenant goes under and didn't pay the utilities, say, for the past 3 months, the landlord must pay it. The second option is called a modified gross lease. In my view, these are better than a regular gross lease. This is typically where the tenant pays the rent and operating expenses, but has to pay his own utilities separately. However, if the operating expenses or taxes increase, the landlord is still on the hook for all of it. In either of these leases, the landlord is vulnerable to increasing taxes. To counteract this, seasoned landlords use what's called a base year. A base year is a clause found in better written gross and modified gross leases. The base year is a year that is actually tied to the actual amount of taxes, insurance, and operating expenses to run the property in a specified year. The actual amount of expenses that are tied to the base year is called the expense stop. This is sort of the floor of your operating expenses, the minimum you'll pay. As the lease goes on, the tenant is responsible for paying an increase above this base year amount. For example, if a new lease is done in, say, 2015, the operating expenses are $3 a square foot for this property. The base year would be 2015, and the expense stop or floor would be $3 a square foot. If in 2016, the property taxes, insurance, and operating expenses increased to, say, $3.50 a square foot, the tenant would be responsible for that increase of 50 cents per square foot. Suffices it to say that even if it's a bit more complicated, it's often well worth it for a landlord to have a base year clause in its leases. It's a tool used by landlords to limit their exposure to increased property taxes, and as such, it helps to maintain predictable cash flow. The final form is called a triple net lease. The triple net lease format is where the tenant pays only its pro rata share of the actual operating expenses for the property. The key is that if any of the operating expenses, say property taxes, go up, the landlord doesn't pay for it, the tenant does. This gives the landlord less risk and more control. The tenants will always absorb the increase in expenses. You can pass along all building maintenance and property management costs directly to the tenants. With a gross or modified gross lease, the landlord would pay these. This is generally more attractive to investors and landlords. In fact, converting a property from gross to triple net leases is a free way to increase the value of a property in the eyes of investors.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that detailed explanation. So of those, which is the best format, or let's say your favorite format of these leases?
I strongly prefer the triple net lease, as they're the ones that give the landlord maximum control, the most predictable expenses, and the highest potential net income, with the fewest surprises. If you have a multi-tenant building, particularly with a diverse tenant base, this is the way you want to go.
Okay, very good. So when you have a building that needs to be leased up, how do you locate tenants?
Well, I'm very proactive. I like to visit other nearby centers and ask if those tenants are happy there. I like to approach successful multi-store owners in the area and ask if they would consider expanding. These are often great prospects because they've proven themselves already in multiple locations. If I have a perfect space for a franchise, I call every possibility on my franchise list. LoopNet and CoStar is an invaluable online marketplace, and you do not need to be a broker to have access to it. Same for Crexy.com, and CityFeet.com also works well. Now there's so many others, it makes your head spin, but you can often pay for a short-term single property subscription. I've used social media such as LinkedIn, and you can also offer your current tenants a rent discount if they find you a tenant. As far as advertising, I think the cardinal sin with a lot of brokers is that they simply don't give enough information, but you can use this to your advantage. When prospects don't have enough, they can't make a decision. So give them all they need to pick your property. Give floor plans, dimensions, panoramic pictures, aerial photos, even a walkthrough video with you narrating the details. You can post that for free on YouTube and then add the link to many of your ads. This will help you weed out the time wasters and those who are unclear of their needs. You don't want to show your space to everyone who calls you. Your time is valuable. You should politely but aggressively pre-qualify prospects. Make sure that they've already seen your demographics, the area, your walkthrough video, drive-by traffic, and pictures, etc., before you meet them for a showing.
Very good. So all great ways to find tenants, right? So, but now the question is, what are the key drivers that you implement to properly vet the tenants?
Well, for me, it all starts with a credit report. I'm always surprised by how few landlords will pull a complete credit report on prospective tenants. I wouldn't bother with one of these Credit Karma credit scores. Nothing against Credit Karma, but you need something a little bit more in depth than just a number on an iPhone. You know, that's a partial picture at best. You can get a free complete credit report at www.annualcreditreport.com. This is the government-sponsored website that has Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. For $10, you can even get credit scores. Next, I like to look at financial statements. I always ask for 2 years to get a sense of their success. If it's a startup, of course, I ask for a business plan and bank statements to show me how much cash or working capital they have business. As we all know, startups are risky for everyone related to it. You want to minimize your risk by doing your homework. If a company is weak on finances, I ask for an additional security deposit, perhaps 2 to 3 months instead of just 1. If they're weak on credit, I'll often ask for a co-signer on the lease or add a personal guarantee. A guarantee makes the individual tenant fully responsible for the lease should the tenant's LLC or corporation go under. Obviously, you need to apply stronger qualifying criteria to someone leasing 5,000 square foot than you do if they're only leasing, say, 900 square foot. In the end, some tenants will not make it no matter what you do. You simply want them to have as much skin in the game as possible. Finally, don't be afraid to loosen your screening criteria or your lease rate for those tough to lease spaces.
Excellent. So once you have found a tenant that you like, what are some of the important deal points that you want to look at in the lease?
Well, some people ask about early termination clauses. The landlords generally want long leases, but tenants generally want shorter, flexible leases. A great way to bridge this is through an early termination clause. It gives a tenant the right to walk away from the lease at a predetermined time, sort of an escape valve, if you will. I always require the tenant give me advance notice, usually 3 to 4 months. I do this so I can have some time to search for a new tenant to refill the space. I also charge the tenant a hefty rent penalty, typically equal to 2 to 3 months. Sorry about that. Typically equal to 2 to 3 months of rent. The penalty money I collect can be used to offset our expenses, like a broker commission on the new tenant. I rarely offer these to new tenants during good economic times. However, I did offer quite a few during the Great Recession. In the end, you want to make the deal work for the tenant rather than let a good tenant get away. In a good economy, odds are they'll stay long-term anyway. We can talk about free rent. Is that a thing in your market? If you don't know, you should find out. If so, what are the typically amounts offered in your area? 1 month, 3 months, set dollar amounts. You may be surprised that in this hot market, you may not have to offer a tenant any at all. However, in Atlanta, we typically offer up to 1 month free base rent per year of lease. We can talk about lease terms. Should you go long? Should you go short? Longer is ideally better for the stability of the property. The less you turn a space over, the fewer months you'll have vacant space waiting to be leased. The less often you'll have to offer concessions. The less often you'll have to make over the space completely for a different use. Frankly, the only time I would offer short-term leases would be when I'm expecting rates to rise suddenly and I don't want to commit to the current rates for the long term. An example would be that right next door, they're building 300 upscale apartments, and that will triple my shopper traffic in the next year. Increased traffic usually means much higher rates. People often ask, should I offer annual rents or flat rents? I'm sorry, annual increases or a flat rent, excuse me. There's nothing inherently wrong with offering a tenant a flat rent, meaning no annual increases in rent. National or publicly held companies will often ask for a flat rent. All others, in my opinion, should have rent increases. You can structure it any way you like, but as a landlord, you always want rent growth. Rent growth allows compound interest to work for you and ratchets up your income numbers. This is important when it comes time to sell the property. Then we can talk about tenant improvements. I prefer to give free rent and let the tenants handle that on their own. It's simply more efficient for the landlord or for the broker. I insist tenants obtain the proper permits and use only insured and licensed contractors. Otherwise, they're in violation of their lease. All manner of problems can pop up during space renovations, taking up more time and expense than originally envisioned. Don't get involved if you don't have to. Also, if it's required, never let a tenant skip the permit process. This will come back to bite you down the road.
Very good. All excellent points. You touched on, obviously as a landlord, you want to improve your cash flow, right? You want to protect your cash flow. But from a tenant perspective, right, what if the operating expenses of a building balloon out of control? Can a tenant request that there are caps or limits on operating expenses? I think they're also known as CAMs, right? Is that something that can be looked at?
They can. CAM, also known as common area maintenance. And the answer is to your question, absolutely. Either party, landlord or tenant, can set a maximum allowable cap on any one item, whether it's plumbing, HVAC, electrical use, whatever you like. It's a great way to make a tenant feel more secure if their expenses have some predetermined limits.
Very good. So once you found a tenant, you vetted all the tenants, and you think that now you have a good candidate, how do you figure out from a big picture perspective whether a tenant is a good fit for a particular building?
Well, there's hard concerns and soft concerns. Some hard concerns would be the actual lease rates, the tenant's improvements, free rent, things that cost or create money. Does this tenant make financial sense for me? Often when you're presented with one lease scenario versus another, sometimes people just pick the one that sounds better. But you or your broker should really perform a net present value calculation to see which one actually makes better financial sense. And then we could talk about some soft concerns. The intangibles. Sometimes it's not about the highest lease rate or the longest lease. It's about the synergy created when you bring in a tenant that creates that dynamic tenant mix, making your center the center that people flock to above others in the area. An example would be an auto repair shop next to an auto body shop, or a casual restaurant next to a bar, etc. Let those tenants trade business back and forth to create stronger businesses for themselves. I recently did a women's gym where we did the lease, and then we did a smoothie shop a few months later, right next to each other. They love having each other next door because it's such a natural fit. It increases shopper traffic for both tenants.
Yeah, that's only a great idea. So once you have agreed on a lease, you have a tenant in place. So what are some of the potential problems that you may have to contend with once you have a tenant or tenants in place?
Well, if you have a number of tenants, you're going to have some that pay late, and those means and you have to enforce late fees. I prefer to not have any side agreements or verbal agreements with tenants. If you get in, this will get you in trouble every time. If you make changes to the deal, even temporary ones, such as a COVID-related rent discount, put it in writing as an addendum to the lease and have both of you initial it. Now, if a person is chronically late, that may lead to a default. But it's okay, because if you've kept that chronic late payer papered properly with all those late payments, then even the tenant calls or emails and it says the check's in the mail. We've heard that 100 times before. As long as you sent your late letters and default letters, if you have to go to court down the road, you'll at least build your case against the tenant, so you can show you've followed the law all the way.
Very good. So now another question is, right, unless you have a property that is in just a core top location, whether it's Times Square in New York City as a prime example that would everyone know, in a lot of instances, one probably could say that commercial space is kind of a commodity, right? So how, as a property owner, can you make sure that your property is unique and stands out from the competition?
Well, through creativity and flexibility in your leasing. You want to offer tenants options they didn't even know were available, or things that other landlords won't. Imagine a startup tenant who needs to keep his leasing expenses low to start, but expects to expand rapidly in the coming years. An example would be like a technology firm. You start in a garage, and 3 years later, you're in 40,000 square foot. You can offer the tenant a right of first refusal to expand into any adjacent spaces if and when it's available. That will meet his current needs now of low cost and to expand when he can afford it down the line without having to have the tenant relocate. This costs you nothing, but really helps the tenants with his long-term planning, and he'll sincerely appreciate it. Think of a tenant who wants to lock into a long-term rate for 5 years, but is not sure he can commit for that long. You can offer him the right to an early termination for a small penalty. Again, no cost to you, but it helps that tenant commit to your property.
Excellent points. Another question I have is, and it's kind of related to also what we do, right? We are commercial mortgage brokers. So we get a lot of questions from borrowers. Why don't we just go directly to a lender so we can save the brokerage fee? So when it comes to a landlord that has space that they need to lease out, there a similar question probably can be brought up. So why should I hire a commercial real estate broker to market that space? Why can't I as a landlord go alone and do it myself?
Well, of course, I'm biased being a broker, but I always think you should hire a broker. And just hear me out. An experienced, connected local broker will have a better handle on the lease rates than you will. They'll be able to find the pressure points, solve problems, soothe the tenant's worries, and make it work for both of you. As a landlord or a property manager, do you even know the correct market rates? Are you up to date with proper concessions? Are you an active marketer, or are you just doing it passively? You will benefit from a great broker's experience, connection, and local market knowledge. Now, it's important to remember that in a strong leasing market, everyone looks like a hero. But the problem with that is that it hides a lot of leasing mistakes. But it doesn't mean you're doing the best job for yourself. If a good broker can even get $1.50 more a square foot, say, than you're asking, then they'll pay for themselves. They'll have direct contact with all the franchises and brand name companies. I've seen uninformed landlords try and go it alone and ask for far above market rents, only to have their spaces vacant for 6 months. That's 6 months of lost income, far more than the cost of a broker commission, or worse, the opposite. They end up giving the space away because they were unaware that the leasing rates suddenly increased since the space was last up for lease. My point is, in trying to save $1, you may be costing yourself a lot more in the long run. An example would be back in 2007, when I sold a strip center to a local investor. I advised him to take on a broker for the vacant spaces. He decided to do it himself. He was a very successful business owner and thought he could handle it. He ended up making so many mistakes, mainly through hubris. He just didn't adjust his rates when the market started to weaken in 2008. And by 2009, his center was half empty. He nearly lost it to foreclosure by the time he hired someone to turn it around. I think it was best said in that old movie, Top Gun, don't let your ego write checks that your body can't cash. Now I'm dating myself, right? You can expect leasing to get more difficult in this coming year. A recession is coming at some point, eventually, who knows when, and it's certainly going to be exacerbated by the lingering COVID problems. Major companies are walking away from their office leases as more and more of us work from home. Many retail stores can no longer justify their brick and mortar footprint, with more and more of us turning to online retail. You should make sure you have a strong broker in your corner to advise you well during the coming turbulent times.
Very good points. So let's assume that the landlord decided that it's the right and smart way to hire a broker to lease out the space. And maybe it's a property that is in a good enough location that it also could attract national credit tenants. Mm-hmm. So then the next question that comes up for a landlord is, should I hire one of these large national firms, or should I hire a local broker?
That's actually a great question. It depends on several things. A local broker will be more apt to respect and service a listing if it's a smaller space. National brokers tend to favor larger listings. It's just the way it is. I'm sure I'll get some hate mail for that, but local brokers share commissions on all listings. Some national brokers will not share commissions on investment property sales, but will usually do it on leases. It's important since you want all brokers to be aware and hopefully promoting your listing. National brokers will tend to be more plugged in with national tenants. So if that's, if you've got a prime corner, then obviously you're looking for a Kroger or a Chase Bank, obviously go with a national broker. If you have a smaller space that would never attract a national tenant, a local broker would be just fine, because it doesn't always matter. If you have to look at your own circumstances and see what you're actually needing. The name and the size of a company is no panacea. It often comes down to the individual broker. What's their level of experience and track record in my area with my type of property in my size range? What's their marketing strategy? How many listings do they have in my immediate area? You should ask the right questions to get the right broker for the job.
Excellent point. Yeah. So now let's say you have the property leased out, where you hired a broker who brought in all great tenants, and it's all hopefully fully leased. Now the next question really is, now what do I do with that property on a day-by-day basis and week and month by month? Should I manage it myself, or should I hire a property manager?
Again, I'm biased here since I'm also a property manager, but I think it almost always makes sense to hire a property manager. Usually when people are wealthy enough to own a shopping center or a large commercial building, they would be best served to pay a small fee to have it professionally managed. If a landlord's time is worth, say, $150 an hour, why would they do work that he could pay someone $30 an hour to handle? We only have so many work hours in a day. So they would be losing $120 per hour when they do $30 an hour work. I can understand being frugal, but not foolish. Besides, most landlords are busy professionals or business owners that will not be able to handle timely issues like a dedicated professional manager would. A recent example, I know of an owner that had a huge pothole that needed repair. The landlord said, "Oh, I'll get around to it." However, weeks later, it still wasn't fixed. And then a shopper drove over it and badly damaged their car, costing the landlord about $1,500 to repair the car, not to mention the loss of goodwill and embarrassment. A good property manager would have been all over that and handled it right away. Another example would be the application of sand and snow melt to icy sidewalks when it gets cold. This is an infrequent yet very timely thing when it's needed. A simple slip and fall could land you in court with a lawsuit for negligence and cost tens of thousands of dollars for you to settle.
Yeah, very good point there. So I think we now also have COVID-19 that is on everyone's mind, right? We have some locations are worse than others when it comes to local restrictions as well as to local regulations, where local authorities restrict evictions of commercial tenants, giving them some additional rights. So talk to us a little bit about how leasing now should be done during the age of COVID-19.
You're absolutely right. The effects of COVID have been very uneven. Some states have been draconian in their responses and some laissez-faire. But generally, it's decimated restaurants, salons, and spas, while barely affecting many other categories. Many landlords are trying to pivot from these categories if possible. For example, if you have a traditional salon, that can be carved up and cut up into individual salon suites that offer greater perceived safety. Restaurants that are fine dining could maybe pivot to takeout or more delivery. Those are faring much better. You need to ask yourself as an owner, what prospects are unaffected or at least less affected by COVID? And can I actively seek those out? Case in point, we lost a fine dining restaurant tenant in September. We ended up replacing them with a popular pizza takeout and delivery shop. Since so few restaurants are open to dine-in customers, this pizza shop's business is actually up over 25% during COVID. So they're doing great, With any space, I always ask, if things go badly, what's my turnaround strategy? What are my options? And how much will those options cost? You just want to do whatever it takes to make your property more COVID resistant, Another leasing assignment I had in October was for a new construction fast food restaurant. I dreaded getting this because I knew it'd be a very difficult space to lease. Of all things, a restaurant during COVID. However, since it was just being built, I was able to convince the landlord to redesign the building at the last minute. We got rid of the drive-through, and we began marketing as a medical space. Within about 30 days, we filled it with an urgent care center with a 10-year lease. So we actually came out smelling like a rose on that one.
Wow, that's great. So obviously you touched on restaurants, right? There are some other tenants that and industries that have been suffering more than others during COVID-19. And I think landlords really need to be very proactive now. So as a landlord and brokers, what can they do to be more aggressive when it comes to marketing their property in that environment?
You know, for me, being nimble and creative is key. Even if I don't currently have a vacancy, I advertise spaces for lease that I think may come vacant in the next 90 days or so. That way, if a tenant doesn't renew his plans or goes under, moves away, I'm not caught off guard. I have a roster of interested prospects to call. For example, I manage a center where a 5,000 square foot tenant recently went away in June. Since I'm in very close touch with my tenants, I saw that she'd really been struggling since April. So I began advertising the space in advance, just in case she went under, and she did. I quickly repositioned the space to attract new users. I found an established medical technology school that was actually using a lot of distance learning. They signed a 6-year lease, and they're operating just fine, basically unimpeded during this COVID time.
Very good. So I think you just highlighted the importance of using a broker, right? You can bring ideas to the table, how to market that property, right? Would you as a landlord think of approaching a medical education or another medical type of company? Maybe you do, but then you still need to find them, right? So I think it's only worthwhile. So hopefully someone hired you and you're able to fill all the space. So the question now is, now the building is full, and now what's the way forward?
Well, it's great that your building's full, but you shouldn't be afraid not to renew tenants that don't work well, that perhaps don't contribute to your current tenant mix, or simply too much trouble to keep around. The late payers, the chronic complainers, perhaps the people make a little too much noise, you know. Second, don't fight the market. You want to adjust and adapt your outlook and your expectations to the market. Don't get too hung up on your own story of or version of the market. Third and last, tenants come and go for a variety of reasons. You can't fight it, but always strive to protect those core tenants. You know, the ones that really drive traffic to your property, the one that you're known for. You know, we have one building where stage 3, a big gym, is the tenants, and people always call it the stage 3 building. I mean, it's like a local landmark in our town now. So, you know, so the point is you want to build on them, protect them, and they'll serve you well.
Yeah, that's a great idea, right? So everyone recognizes the building. So it helps everyone, right? It helps you as a landlord as well as the tenants.
Yes.
So I think you added great value here, and obviously I think everyone, hopefully after listening to your outline, is convinced that one should use a leasing broker to lease up a commercial building. But let's discuss leasing commissions. Obviously, it's not free. So could you touch on that a little bit and how it's different from residential leasing?
Of course. Well, at first and foremost, it's far more negotiable. There are lots of formulas depending upon what state you live in. For a mom and pop tenant, you might pay 1 month's rents or 5% of the total base rents if it's a triple net lease. For a national or credit tenant, you might pay 1 month's rents plus 4% of the total base rent, because you can always expect to pay a higher commission for a high quality national name brand that does, say, a 5, 7, or 10-year lease. You want to negotiate with your broker, but don't skimp. Remember, brokers will tend to show the listings that pay them well. It's simply good business practice for them. Give them a good reason to show yours. In conclusion, leasing is a fairly simple subject that virtually anyone can master. It just takes a conscientious person and a willingness to ask for professional help when needed. You should be proactive or hire brokers and property managers that will strongly advocate for you. For economic and COVID-related reasons, this will be a tougher year for leasing, but that doesn't mean you can't thrive in 2021. Use everything at your disposal to protect your properties.
All great points. Thank you very much, Alan. So I think you added great value to our listeners. So if someone would like to reach out to you, how can you be reached?
I can be reached at alan@drpbrokers.com. DRP as in David, Roger, Paul. Alan at DRP Brokers. I'd be happy to share a free net present value calculator. I can share some of my other articles that I've written, such as leasing from a tenant's perspective, so people understand both sides of the coin. Happy to offer any sort of commentary that can help anyone. So.
Okay, very good. And you cover what areas of the market, just at from a geographic perspective?
I'm licensed in both the state of Georgia and the state of New Mexico.
Okay, very good. So thanks again, Alan. That was very valuable, and appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Love to be back again.